Today's video is brought to you by Audible. Audible is an amazing service which offers a huge selection to listen to, but it is also one of the best ways to make huge savings on 40k audiobooks. This month I'm beginning an audiobook club and we're kicking off with Valdor, Birth of the Imperium. You can join us and start listening today with a 30-day Audible trial. Get a free audiobook and full access to thousands of select originals, audiobooks and podcasts included in the Audible Plus plan. Visit audible.com/Lutin or text Lutin to 500-500 for those of you in the US. Full details about my new audiobook club follow at the end of this video. Each month we'll be listening to a new audiobook, and at the end of that month I'll host a live stream where we will discuss the core themes and events. As always, all relevant links are listed directly below in the video notes. We return to our Adeptus Titanicus series now with another conflict during the Heresy era, no less devastating than any other. This campaign is known within Imperial records as the Cataclysm of Iron. Like many of the conflicts during the time of the Heresy, the specifics of their timings are vague and overlapping, but most of these Titanic battles are recorded as having happened in what would be described as the first phases, that is, earlier in the Heresy period of M31, and then secondary later phases where the decisive battles would be fought in the later stages of the Heresy. It's not specifically relevant, but I feel worth reminding that for all that it's talked about, and for how important it was, the Horus Heresy is recorded as roughly only having taken place over what amounts to 9 Terran years, from roughly 05 to 014 of M31. These dates are of course approximate, and whilst the period is rammed with heroic stories and details, it can really be summarised relatively easily as Horus rallying a force of traitors, leading a huge campaign of destruction to Terra itself to challenge the Emperor, and then ultimately failing. These stories of titanic warfare and huge battles between Space Marine legions are in many ways subsidiary, but of course still highly important. The point is that while Horus was leading his campaign to Terra, and the legions were ripping apart the Imperium directly or indirectly, other factions like the Mechanicum suffered equally greatly from broken internal divisions, and this is what we have seen with all the traitor Mechanicum titans turning against the Loyalists. The Titanic battles between god engines were devastating, of course, on a practical level, but the real damage was the fracturing of the cult Mechanicus to the point it would eventually lead to what would become known as the Dark Mechanicum, and the remaining loyalist Adeptus Mechanicus being created. For those who may not realise why this is so devastating for the Imperium, Mechanicus are not just worshippers of machines or technicians, they exist under the banner of the Imperium, but stand really as an individual faction that is merely closely allied to the Imperium, and this is why even to this day there is elements of suspiciousness and wariness towards the Mechanicus. Despite this though, none could risk any further disruption between the Mechanicus and the Imperium because of just how critical they are. They provide all the technological miracles used by the Imperium. They are the few who have even what you would consider to be a basic understanding of the extremely advanced technologies used within the Imperium. Their Forge Worlds produce the critical hardware needed to support the Imperium's endless wars, and it's only through the stability of these Forge Worlds that the Imperium could ever hope to retain its grip on the galaxy. Each Forge World is of course bound not to Terra, but to Mars and the Fabricated General. Except this unity had been far from what you would consider to be in any state of permanency. The Forge Worlds stood alone during the Age of Strife, and in many regards developed their own sense of independence. And Ryza is a good example. Even in the modern age, it's not known truly if Ryza is 100% loyal to the Mechanicus as a galactic organization, or the Imperium for that matter. It's very possible that many Forge Worlds administrations consider that a second Age of Strife could occur at any time, and so it should remain that they are prepared to once again stand against the Darkest Knights alone, if necessary. Hence, Ryza's apparently hidden assets that were conveniently stockpiled and only used when all appeared lost and their hand was forced by the traitors assaulting their world. So similarly to Ryza, many of the Forge Worlds had some grievance or rivalries with other Forge Worlds, especially if they were in close proximity, and the heresy enabled these to boil over into the open, and some were ruined by their supposedly loyal kin. Many of these conflicts though were fairly isolated and salvageable in the aftermath. Few, if any, of these internal conflicts are comparable to what we will look at today, and what is known as the Cataclysm of Iron. This devastating conflict is contained within the supplementary element for the tabletop Titanicus game Crucible of Retribution. And a small aside, if you have never taken a look at the Titanicus game, I do advise you to do so. It's actually been increasing in popularity, and it's an adjacent tabletop game to the core 40k. It focuses on battles between the devastating Titan legions, and the core game enables you to fight open battles or play out narrative engagements, which the supplements like Titan Death, Shadow and Iron, Defense of Ryza focus on, and these are some of the most apocalyptic battles in Imperial history. As per usual, all the links down below, and I've actually got multiple videos discussing these Titanic struggles already, including the Psi Titans and the conflict on Titan Death. Both will be linked via the end portal of this video. But now we will enter into the Cataclysm of Iron, the Crucible of Retribution. That is to say, the galactic southwestern region of Imperial space bordering two segmentums, and this would become a boiling pit of bitter vengeance between rival Forge Worlds, grinding one another into a furnace of white-hot titanic battles. I know not if victory across the galaxy can be achieved. All I know is this world will burn, and we will be the ones to ignite its pyre. The so-called Belt of Iron is an area of space as noted to the galactic southwest of Terra, but still within its fairly close periphery relative to the whole of Imperial space. And while it's named for its Forge Worlds, these Mechanicum planets were but a small percentage of the total planets within the designated region. Many systems containing hundreds of human worlds were located within the Belt of Iron. Like most sectors of Imperial space, these planets held designations such as Agri or Hive worlds that supported one another and fed the needs of the more important and resource-hungry planets like a Forge or Primary Factorum Hive world. All Hive planets will have a degree of manufacturing, but some will be more heavily committed to this and rely far more on external resource support. During the reunification of the human empire as part of the Emperor's Great Crusade, the Belt of Iron was found to be a particularly beneficial discovery for all concerned. The Forge Worlds, despite having been in relatively close proximity to one another, had still remained isolated during the Age of Strife. So, when the Crusade came through, they benefited from the security and stability of a unified human empire. And of course, the Imperium benefited from their production of war materials and the addition of new Titan legions. Titan legions were useful during the Crusade either to reinforce and create a strong defensive presence on worlds which required a permanent force, while the Astartes legions continued on their quest into the dark voids of the galaxy, searching for lost human colonies who had, by some chance, survived the Age of Strife. Or, the Titans could also be used as a show of force against planets which may have felt they had some hope of resisting the Imperium. Although this was not especially common, most planets actually welcomed reunification, but where there was resistance, it was generally preferred to try and resolve this by diplomacy, not force, as the entire point of the reunification was to achieve this constructively, although this certainly varied from Space Marine legion to legion. Some thought it better to break the will of a world and move on quickly than spend a great deal of time converting a populace. So deploying Titans was often enough to help a civilization realize they had no hope of resisting the imperial forces of the Emperor. This needed not always be seen so negatively as well. Sometimes it may be enough that they were just shaken from their delusions caused from the centuries of isolation. I say centuries, the age of strife is estimated at having lasted for anything like 5 millennia. It is said though that the worst of the resistance to the Emperor's crusade came in fact from Forge Worlds. These heavily defended Cult Mechanicus bastions had generally fared considerably better than planets with mere human populations, and so when the time came for reunification, many resisted, because they saw no need for it. This led to battles which would lay the seeds of bitterness and grievance, especially when forced reunification came at the hand of neighbouring titans of adjacent Forge Worlds. This was especially true within the Belt of Iron, and so by the end of the Crusade, this area now spanned from the edge of the Pacifico segmentum into Tempestus. Reunification had brought little benefit to the Forge Worlds within the Belt of Iron. If anything, the opposite, some felt weakened by having now to pledge their vital defences and materials to a wider empire, and many longed for earlier times where they need only worry about the goings-on within their own borders. Not contributing their powerful military hardware to battles far away, they felt that they had no stake in, and many of these worlds, not dissimilarly to Riser, would take an opportunity to distance themselves from the red planet of Mars, home of the Mechanicum. Some, though, felt entirely the opposite. They were willing to sacrifice degrees of independence for the huge benefit they received by gaining the shared knowledge of both the Mechanicum and the wider Imperium, and began to understand that they were far more important when part of the greater whole than as an isolated island in the vast void oceans of the galaxy, alone, insignificant and precarious. To no surprise, these festering ideological differences required minimal agitation by the traitors within the heresy when it descended on the Imperium to begin a devastating galactic regional conflict between the Forge Worlds. However, the beginnings or initial phases, if you will, were far from outright conflicts. In fact, mirroring many worlds across the Imperium in the early days of the heresy, there was far more of a period that resembled a Cold War for several years, where planets and factions had to play a very careful game of trying to determine just who were their friends and who were their enemies. More positive actions where stealth and subterfuge, as well as sabotage, became the next cards to play, attempting to undermine rivals with surgical interventions and assaults carefully covered to conceal the source of any attack. The effects, though, were minimal and merely inflamed tensions and rivalries further, so that when conflict did break out into the open, it was furious, bitter, and raging. The Titan legions would deliver retribution and death upon their enemies, the scale of which was, of course, Titanic. Now, ordinarily, I have not needed to lay down specifics within a system when it comes to Titanic conflicts of the heresy, but within the Cataclysm of Iron, knowledge of the planets and worlds within the systems is essential to both the cause for and resolution of the entire campaign. The 6 core worlds within the Belt of Iron, which are of critical importance to us, are as follows. Firstly, Atar Median. This world was actually founded early during the Great Crusade, and this seems unusual, but the reason for this occurrence was due to, in fact, another Forge world known as Phaeton. Within the Segmentum Solar, they had resisted the control of Mars, and Phaeton was extremely stubbornly independent and came into conflict with Mars over arguments about its autonomy. The tensions nearly rose to full-scale conflict, but Phaeton relented at the last minute and agreed to pay a tribute by sending an entire third of its forces to Mars. However, rather than undertaking the agreed transaction, the tech priests of Phaeton would instead throw their tribute seemingly at random into the void in a final act of spite. These forces would eventually come to settle at Atar Median, and their titans, known as Legio Atarus, were established here. Incidentally, Phaeton was known to be the second most productive Forge world in the Imperium after Mars during this point in time. As for Atar Median itself, having been founded with a third of the strength of Phaeton, it was a lesser world than many established Forge worlds, yet it very quickly flourished. It was defended vigilantly by the Legio Atarus and the fast rise of Atar along with their desire to prove themselves, having had no history or heritage of their own, led to a distinct feeling of superiority among the other Forge Worlds in the Belt of Iron, who felt that this upstart Forge World, so shiny and new with no struggle or history, was most certainly beneath them, and as a result many outright refused to work with or accept communications from Atar instead would attempt to connect with the wider Imperium and would then contribute Legio Ataris to the expeditionary fleets. The desire for the tech priests of Atar though was not exactly ideal. It led to the Legio Ataris seeking to prove themselves by some act of dramatic victory or bravery, and they sought to almost construct situations by which they could create a name for themselves, some history for their world, and so would often be quicker to engage in combat than was preferable, and created a reputation for themselves in the process, except not really that which they had hoped for. They became known for their negative reputation of being unhelpfully enthusiastic to a pathological degree. They were regarded as firebrands who were quick to shoot first and discuss later. It did, however, embed Atar and the Ataris within the Imperium, and they would become only further aligned to the Loyalists when a large force of Titans were lost at Isstvan V. Atar was already well aware of the tensions within the Belt of Iron, and so would then begin preparations early on to increase the power, size, and strength of their Titan legions and general planetary defences. They understood all too well that the Belt of Iron was effectively a planetary tinderbox, and the smallest spark would be enough to engulf them all in fire. Graia is a problematic planet, and so it's important that I should note that there exists a conflict as to its specific location within the Imperium, as it's specifically referenced in two very different regions across multiple sources. This is actually kind of unusual. Usually there is a conflict here or there, but often not so much as there is with this world, which is very strange. This of course gladly though adds to my continued reminder that much of the lore in 40k, especially details recorded by the Imperium, are vague, contradictory, sometimes entirely deliberately misleading. Graia is stated by some sources, old and new, as being located within the Segmentum Tempestus, that is to say the Belt of Iron that we're currently discussing. However, a roughly equal amount of sources also place it within the eastern regions of Ultramar, so not even close, in the Ultima Segmentum. And tangent within a tangent, this is the same Graia that appears in the Space Marine game. So what should we believe? Is Graia nearer to Terra in Tempestus or far out on the fringes of Ultramar in the galactic east? My personal feeling is that its location within Tempestus seems to be more attributed to widely known conflicts like the Heresy, whereas the Ultramar location is more singular and specific. Of course, there is always a possibility that two Graias exist, which could have come from some kind of imperial bureaucratic administrative error, who knows, but now you know the conflicting debate of just where the hell is Graia. Lastly, I would just note that most currently stated does not necessarily equate to most correct within 40k either, and as I've said before, sometimes you just end up having to make your best estimation given the information available and the parameters that we understand to exist. Anyway, returning to the actual planet, and obviously from here on I will refer to it as being placed within the Belt of Iron in Segmentum Tempestus, Graia is the most prosperous forge world of the Belt of Iron, and much of this is because its production is geared towards the manufacturing of so-called god engines, that is of course the power plants for Titans. Graia is surrounded by a network of orbital stations and principal forges known as the Graia Crown. Worth noting that not all Mechanicus forges are necessarily located on a planet itself. Often forge worlds will have vast orbital platforms that encircle or surround an entire world. Mars, for example, has a massive ring that surrounds the entire world. Graia is able to support a large Titan Legio due to its vast production capabilities and was easily brought into the Imperium, who had been originally nervous about approaching the Forge World, which clearly wielded such immense power during the unification. Thankfully though, the tech priests of Graia used vast cogitation stacks in the depths of their planet to produce highly accurate data predictions, and so they easily saw the worth and logic for them joining the Imperium and the reign of Mars, and a treaty was quickly drawn that would enable Graia control over many planets within its localized systems. The Graia Crown of Primary Forges, which geometrically encompasses the planet, has a quite specialized functionality, and while the Adeptus Mechanicus does not make it widely known, it is said to be capable of independent flight. Usually, any platforms around a world are constrained by a world's gravity, but the Graia Crown is said to use giant fusion engines to enable it to escape the planet's gravity and move to the nearest Mandeville point, and then even be able to enter the warp itself. Tangent: what is a Mandeville point? This is the minimum safe distance that a void ship can safely enter or exit warp space from its origin or to its destination system, respectively. What this means is that you can't just leave the orbit of a planet and enter warp space. You basically have to get the hell away from a planet or other things before entering the warp. Some incorrectly assume that Imperial ships can just enter the warp at any point that they choose. This thinking most likely comes from overlap with other fictional verses whereby entering fast-and-light travel is as simple as putting your ship into warp gear. This is not the case with 40k. Warp travel within 40k is extremely dangerous, and entering or exiting the warp occurs by basically tearing a huge hole through material space and indeed reality itself. Some points within a star system will therefore be known as being the safest or objectively best point for accessing the warp, and they may be what you would consider to be a Mandeville conjunction. That is a point which is optimal to enter the warp for all ships across multiple planets, determined simply by their galactic position relative to one another. With all that said, there are rare possibilities to enter the warp by means of so-called warp gates. Now, warp gates are extremely rare, however, and are assumed to have been created in the dark age of technology by humanity. They appear of human origin, but that is all that is known. They allow entry to the warp far closer than would otherwise be safe to do so, and the benefits of this are obvious, but unfortunately this technology is far outside the understanding of the Imperium, and for that reason warp gates will be extremely heavily guarded by the Imperial Navy. And no, the Mechanicus are not going to just reverse engineer them, and I have explained why many times at this point. Graia has reportedly moved the orbital crown multiple times in its history, and in the modern age, while Imperial records currently claim Graia's priesthood have returned to circumnavigate their home world, at least one rogue trader report lists the planet's orbit as strangely empty. Returning though to the time of heresy for Graia, it is a world known for its tenacity and relentless pursuit of its goals, and this appears tied to the Magi's reliance on their cogitation stacks, which give them predictions which encourage them to attempt missions that others would deem impossible, or a suicide mission. This is because the tech priests of Graia trust in their data. If their logic is sound, they will succeed. The heresy was a tense time for Graia for this exact reason. The priests approach all things from a position of pure logic, and this means to a large degree disregarding such things as emotional loyalty, but purely examining the facts and data of a situation. So, at the outbreak of the heresy, there were many who argued that they should not be in a default position of loyalty to the Imperium, but instead they should exhibit a thorough examination of all details available to determine their best position. They quickly though determined that the Emperor's forces were vastly superior, and therefore their allegiance should remain with the Imperium. However, a troubling cloud hangs over Graia, in that as many have speculated since, had the Forge World known the true power of the War Master's forces and the additional powers behind the traitors, would they have been so quick to remain with the Loyalists and the Imperium? It is a troubling consideration that means the Imperium has to continue to keep a close eye on the world of Graia. Valia Maximal would be one of those worlds which could have avoided a painful transition into the Imperium, but who through millennia of isolation had believed themselves to be far more powerful than they were comparative to the might of the Imperium. The rulers of Valia Maximal were unlike other systems in their galactic proximity, and they resisted becoming subservient to the all-powerful human empire. They claimed as many as 24 systems around them as being their sovereign territory, and having dominated the region and even having exterminated an ancient human Xenos micro-empire, which was presumably forged during the Dark Age of technology, when mankind's outlook toward Xenos was very different to that of the extremely xenophobic Imperium, Valia Maximal, believing itself to be powerful enough to challenge any aggressors, felt that simply a show of force along its borders should be sufficient to ward off and in fact dissuade any who might seek to challenge their territory, and they hoped, if it came to it, that this would just strengthen their position in any subsequent negotiations. This, of course, was a catastrophic error of judgment, and made only worse by the fact that after initial diplomacy, a fleet was sent out from the Forge World in an attempt to expel the Imperials from their territory. The following localized war between the Imperium's expeditionary fleet and Forge World Valia Maximal was humbling for the would-be isolationists. Led by Astartes of the Raven Guard, who fell swiftly upon the Forge World with Titan Legio Astroman of Graia to counter that of the Forge World, much to their astonishment. War consumed the world and diplomatic solutions were then swiftly sought, yet even as a peace was being brokered, forces had not received orders to disengage and many hundreds of thousands died for essentially nothing. Through this engagement, the Titan Legions of Graia and the Forge World itself would become a bitter word spoken by those on Valia Maximal, and even though they had effectively brought this punishment upon themselves, this was a fact that would be erased from collective memory almost as soon as the conflict had ceased, and all of those upon Valia Maximal would remember from that day a thirst for a bitter vengeance upon the Titans and Forges of Graia. Although initially painful, Valia Maximal benefited from its entry into the Imperium. The Mechanicum of Mars found it was able to produce advanced alloys through a process of hardening using extracted elements from its natural environment, and these were shown to be highly resistant to corrosion and plasma and would enable Mars to produce higher quality and quantity of alloys for extended deployment of Imperial hardware to hazardous worlds. Despite this success, the painful manner by which Valia Maximal had been brought into the Imperium, combined with its bitter feeling toward Graia, meant that upon the outbreak of the heresy, Valia wasted little time in declaring its allegiance with the War Master, and then establishing a solid ring of defense around its home Forge planet. Then they would send out a continual supply to aid the traitors within the Ultima Segmentum, but this was a dangerous and lengthy mission to undertake, and they were frequently raided by friend and foe alike en route to their ultimate destination. The grudge between Valia and Graia was still to play out, and it would as the Belt of Iron entered now into the period of Cataclysm. Calabrax is a world strewn with scars of a painful history, a Forge world that, if judging by the ruins across its surface are anything to go by, could have rivaled Mars itself at one point. When the expeditionary fleets of the Imperium arrived, they found a world still in the midst of an apocalyptic civil war, and like many Forge worlds, bizarre tech cultists had become twisted versions of what was now the modern Mechanicum and Cult Mechanicus. On Calabrax, the dominant cult known as the Endeavour of Airless Purity sought to sterilize the galaxy and purge all biological life. The Imperium made contact with the survivors of the world who opposed this strange tech cult, and with their powerful forces they soon turned the tables. Unfortunately, the world itself was all but destroyed, a broken apocalyptic landscape of twisted metal and ancient ruins of a long-forgotten but once glorious civilization. The Imperium gifted the world a newly migrated population to bolster its thin amount of survivors, as well as reinforcing the remnants of what would have been its Titan Legion drawn from the Legio Mortis. The Titan Legion of Calabrax, known as Legio Culisatae, was dramatically altered by the arrival of these new Titans, and the world now felt strong ties to Mars itself and, more importantly, to the Fabricator General. When the heresy came, Calabrax surprised many by immediately declaring allegiance to the Imperium and to sever its ties with the traitor-fractured forces of the Mechanicum, even executing many who were said to have been aligned to Mars. But many were highly skeptical of this. It seemed very surprising that Calabrax would have had such a strong and immediate split when many had indeed expected the opposite. unfortunately named for the bizarre arachnoid megafauna that long ago walked the surface of the world and thankfully hunted to extinction by Legio Venator, Arachnus would sit at the centre of an empire who had weathered the age of strife and now strongly opposed domination by the Imperium. There was little diplomacy to be had. When the expeditionary forces arrived, Arachnus demanded it retain its sovereignty outright, a message that was unlikely to be well received by Imperial forces, who promptly deployed multiple Titan legions to engage the empire of Forge World Arachnus. It was not long before they had suffered catastrophic losses. As much as 75% of their empire fell to the Imperium in short order, and they were quickly pushed to a surrender or face total obliteration. To no surprise, the violent suppression of the Forge World did not leave an especially good relationship between the planet's inhabitants and the Imperium and Mars. However, their production of specialized laser tech, which was favored by the Custodes, helped Arachnus to gain fast and reaching influence within the Imperium, which helped to quell some of the sour feelings they had from their initially brutal subjugation by the expeditionary fleet. Still though, dampening bitterness and outright loyalty were far from being one and the same. Strangely, Arachnus Legio Venator held an entirely opposite perspective to those on the Forge World itself. The Legio had been functioning in the service of the Great Crusade for some time and had been accustomed to the ideas of self-sacrifice and loyalty to the Imperium, and this created significant friction when they would be rotated back to the Forge World for refitting and encountered the opinions and widely held views of the population on the Forge World, who were still extremely bitter and looking for a way out of remaining in the Imperium. So, as the Cataclysm of Iron descended upon this region of the Imperium, it would only make matters worse for them. Urdesh was a world which lay on the border of the Pacificus and solar segmentum of the Imperium, and Urdesh was yet another world that, upon rediscovery, had been found to have lost a huge amount of both its infrastructure and knowledge, including the ability of how to construct Titans. Yet it still, upon investigation, was of interest to the Mechanicum of the time. This was in no small part because where it lost more specialized knowledge, it was still functional enough of a Forge World to output significant quantities of more basic materials required by, say, the Imperial Guard. It was therefore easy enough to bring the planet back under the banner of the Imperium. Mars would supply them with an ongoing new force of Titans, and in return they pledged their loyalty and production for the Imperial cause. It was one example of how the arrival of Imperial expeditionary forces could sometimes bring worlds back to the human empire with minimal, if any, trouble at all. However, what had appeared to be an easy and secure addition turned out to in fact be a weakened planet when it came to its sense of loyalty to the Imperium. Its loss of knowledge meant that Urdesh had a great desire to continually reinforce its lost strength, and when loyalist Mechanicum and then neighbouring Forge Worlds refused to grant it the lost knowledge for Titan construction, when the heresy came around and the promises of the traitor Fabricator General were easy enough to then turn the world against the Emperor. Urdesh, though, was still a minor world comparative to most major Forge Worlds, and so it would supply materials to cells of traitor saboteurs within Segmentum Solar, who would create disruption and generally prepare to undermine the Imperials as and when the War Master's main fleet would enter the system. Urdesh's role was effectively to prepare for a resistance of traitors. Dironth is known for being one of the Forge Worlds which most heavily resisted reunification with the Imperium. They had established quite the powerful local dominion over systems and even another Forge World, and when the rogue trader militants, effectively the scout ships for the Crusade fleets, arrived to open diplomacy, they were completely obliterated without warning. Dironth immediately prepared its forces for all-out war, as it was sure that reinforcements would be on the way. The ensuing war in fact lasted several years between the Imperium and the regional empire of Forge World Dironth. Many, if not all, records of this time have now been purged, and so all that remain are what are by now likely heavily biased accounts that lay all blame at the feet of the rulers of Dironth, where it is described how they committed horrific crimes by any means necessary to resist the Imperium, not limited to biological warfare and even unspecific references to advanced mechanical intelligence, more advanced than that of the Cult Mechanicus with its Legio Cybernetica, which are basically cyborgs more than robots by deliberate design of the Mechanicus, of course to avoid the extreme fears they have of artificial intelligence. Still, even if you account for the very likely biased recording of the situations, these acts of turning a hive planet into an ashen mass grave by unleashing viral agents or using potentially abominable intelligence are not out of the realm of possibility for an isolated pocket of humanity who have nothing to lose. It's not known specifically how advanced the artificial constructs of Duranth were. It's suggested they were somewhere in between machine spirit and full AI, and were not necessarily true AI, but this is completely heretical, undoubtedly. Duranth would ultimately, and depending on your perspective, perhaps tragically fail to defend itself, and so in the aftermath it would be spared nothing in the eyes of both the Imperium and the Mechanicum. Not only had they resisted, but clearly unleashed untold horrors on the forces of the Emperor's glorious new Imperium. As a consequence, Duranth would be completely stripped of its worth in both wealth and materials. It was reduced to outputting only the most basic of supplies for the Imperium and was reduced to essentially a backwater world. It still was granted Titans as was the norm for Forge worlds, but an absolute bare-bones contingent. Lastly, in a final humiliation, its name was erased, forever to be purged from the hearts and memories of its citizens and the Imperium at large. It would from here on be known as Gerulus Station. As was often the case on many worlds violently suppressed by the Imperium, there remained a contingent of the original inhabitants, the tech priests of Duranth, but who disappeared all from view by the time the Imperium had won victory. Many worlds experience pockets of resistance to the Imperium, but rarely do these amount to anything. So the tech priests of Gerulus Station were left to skulk and crawl around in the darkness below the surface, murmuring their ancient data streams and dreaming of a world that they had fought so hard for, but ultimately had been crushed by the irresistible force of the Imperium. Arlieth was in stark contrast to the previous Forge world a very minor planet. It was certainly a low production grade Forge world, and it produced supplies mainly for agri-worlds. However, the Mechanicum were interested in Arlieth far beyond what it appeared to be at face value. The Age of Strife had different effects on regions of humanity's once great galactic federation, and some worlds drifted into a slow regression, simply forgetting what they once had known, either through brief, violent bursts of civil war which left a weakened society to survive in a very basic sense, or perhaps through invasive psychic creatures of the warp. The higher sections of society could be obliterated, leaving only the more simple peasantry style of citizenry, and still planets were often isolated then for millennia, so it could equally be just a natural shift away from technology, not entirely dissimilarly to night worlds who reverted to something of a feudal life, shunning modern tech for the most part. So Arlieth appeared very much in this light, yet further exploration showed that below its face value surface life, it secretly harboured vast complexes of ancient archaeotech, and this was very obviously of high priority and interest for the Mechanicum because a lot of it remained intact. However, this tech did not appear to be in fact of human origin. It was not of the Golden Age humans, but constructed by an entirely other, now lost civilization. Although the tech priests who existed on the planet were well aware of these lost and advanced ruins, they had not been able to unlock the secrets, and believed that if they were able to, it would imbue them with the power to converse directly with the Omnissiah. As a relatively peaceful society, Arlieth allowed itself to join the Imperium on the condition that the tech priests could continue investigating these strange ruins as had become so critical to their culture. The Imperium in return demanded a large increase in mining output, which was soon easily achieved by as much as 10 times the previous output. Arlieth would remain loyal during the heresy and was still to exist as an important world in exporting raw materials in high quantities for production, but its citizens really regarded the Rebellion of Horus as more of an irritating distraction, that threatened their continued investigation of its ancient tech, and something that they should really concern themselves with. Their lack of enthusiasm to join the traitors was seemingly more by way of apathy than anything else, and switching sides was just more trouble than it was worth, when all they were concerned with was, after all, unlocking the secrets buried beneath their world. There are various other planets that were of relevance within the Belt of Iron, but which were not primary Forge worlds. One important planet was Findari's Spoil, near to Atar Median. It was the sole remainder of a system which showed signs of once having been occupied by multiple planets, but some power or event long ago had destroyed all the others, leaving only Findari. It was not rich in resources, but during the Cataclysm of Iron, it provided a stable warp route through the destabilizing ruin storm that was created by Lorgar. The other main location of note is the Nidrina sector, containing multiple worlds of worth. It was essentially an area with as many as 13 worlds suitable for mining operations, 3 industrial worlds were colonized, 2 fleet anchorages and a hive world. Its main importance was the vast amounts, obviously, of mineral wealth, which were then maintained by multiple primary Forge worlds. By the end of the Great Crusade, the hive world of Shiloki II was now in control of distribution of the massive wealth of materials to Forge worlds in the Belt of Iron, the treaties of which were renegotiated every 10 years within the region, and this led to many Forge worlds attempting to bribe their way to more substantial allocations of raw resources. The worlds of Graia and Atar Median, who would end up becoming aligned with the Loyalists in the heresy, had often swayed the sector through promises of extended support and technology. Unsurprisingly, a situation which did not go down especially well with the other Forge worlds, who already held bitter opinions towards these 2 Loyalist Forge worlds. The situation within the Belt of Iron was essentially at a diplomatic breaking point by the time the heresy had arrived. The Forge worlds of the Cult Mechanicus within the region held centuries, if not longer, of bitter rivalries, and their ever more divided opinions of one another only helped fuel an accelerating downward spiral of antagonization, which would eventually boil over into a regional civil war. It is of course debated by Imperial scholars and historical analysts, had the heresy not occurred, the region here was already on course for a breakdown so severe it would have caused a regional conflict regardless. It was merely that the heresy presented a situation that caused tensions to boil over far more quickly than they may have done otherwise. As word of the chosen son of the Emperor, Horus's rebellion, reached the Belt of Iron, and the drip of information filtered into the worlds that constituted the band of Forge worlds, some made near immediate declarations of loyalty and backed this with physical actions, such as Atar Median's dispatch of Titans to the Istvan system. Other Forge worlds, however, were more guarded and chose to keep their cards closer to their chest, initially dismissed as being just yet more examples of spiteful rivalry. This soon was called into question when actual skirmishes began to be reported. Some worlds like Valia Maximal simply declared outright that they would side with the War Master. Defensive constructions both planetside and orbital were being prepared, and Titan Legios were activated and deployed. Everything was being placed on the highest alert, and scouts and scanning systems trawled local sectors for signs of approaching enemies. This high alert standoff continued over a period of roughly 5 years, but by the Imperial recorded year of 010 M31, communications between rival Forge worlds had effectively ceased. Sides had been chosen, and the traitors were more clearly defined. One of the first major engagements occurred at Pyrio 3, when 14 Titans were destroyed and millions of civilians perished as a result. The Forge world of Atar Median noted that the arrival of the Astartes Iron Warriors via the Findari Spoil region was a moment which only filled the Loyalists with a sinking feeling of cold dread. Findari Spoil had indeed been occupied by the Iron Warriors, and worse, it was now supported by several maniples of the Legio Culisetai. These were the Legio from Calabrax that had been reinforced by Legio Mortis. This was especially problematic, as despite Findari Spoil being a dead world, This was of course not the issue facing the Loyalists. Findari Spoil was a critical warp jump location, and so establishing control of the space around this system meant securing control also of the planet. The Mechanicum forces from Atar Median split, so they were able to simultaneously engage in both orbital and ground assaults. Boarding orbital structures, they were able to quickly eradicate those on board and secured a relatively straightforward victory, but the ground assault on the planet was the far more problematic battle. Legio Arcturus Titans deployed to the surface in dangerous proximity to the traitors' defences, but this was all too common, a trait of the Firebrands, who were known for these wild and unexpected tactics. Their gamble to catch the Calabrax Titans unaware paid off, but the withering fire from the fortresses during deployment cost them 4 Titans, who were barely able to escape their landers before being crippled or simply consumed by critical plasma detonations. It was still a gamble worth having taken though, because as the Firebrand Titans were storming the fortress, laying down heavy fire and having already taken minimal damage from bursting out of their landers, circumventing the ordinary protocols, the traitor Titans were still engaging their awakening rituals, while the Loyalist fire was battering the exterior fortress. The reports of the assault state how the traitors were barely able to engage before the fight was already over. The Firebrand Titans of Atar Median seized the perimeter of the fortifications and immediately pressed onward. Another 6 traitor Titans were destroyed after more combat, and the Loyalists sustained varying degrees of non-critical but sometimes severe damage. For the traitors, the humiliation was not over, as 4 Titans still in their repair cradles were seized by the Firebrand Legio. In the aftermath, Legio Taurus spent its time securing Findari spoil and reinforcing defences, as well as hunting down the traitors who had escaped. Within one system solar week, they had complete control over the Findari spoil system. A victory was always a positive thing, but upon the Forge World of Atar Median, they knew that this was merely the beginning. While the first victory for the Loyalists had been important and thankfully straightforward, the near simultaneous counter-assault by the traitors would hit back twice as hard. The critical production subsector of Neodrina had been eyed with greed for some time by those Forge Worlds who resented their forcible entry into the Imperium, and they now sought to take by force that which they believed themselves to be entitled to. It was only a couple of weeks after the Loyalists had arrived and secured Findari spoil and its warp entry point did the traitors enter the Neodrina subsector. These ships were cited as being aligned with the Forge Worlds of Urdesh and Calabrax, and they smashed through perimeter defences with ease and moved to secure a primary base of operations within the region. Their timing for this was in fact perfect, as they had entered the system during the typical cycle for negotiations within the subsector. The worlds of Atar Median and Graia had traditionally benefited most, but it was custom during this time for each Forge World only to be allowed to maintain a minimal presence within the subsector for obvious reasons. So the arrival of the traitors with scores of Titans made this system essentially ripe for the plucking. One wonders how, given the situation, this oversight had not been considered more thoroughly by the Loyalist Forge Worlds, as they were by now well aware of the dangers to them and the Imperium. So it seems a heavy mistake on behalf of the Loyalists. In fact, the Loyalists barely engaged with the enemy at all, quickly conceding they were absolutely outgunned and any attempt at defense would be futile, suicidal and a waste of materials. Instead, they regrouped and redeployed at the Shilokini system, and their aim would be to defend the subsector's capital Hive world and hope that they could hold out long enough for reinforcements to arrive. The traitors continued to secure worlds around the sector and take control of various adjacent systems, but largely ignored the capital world initially. When they did so, they were finally slowed and even became stuck in a difficult battle of attrition with the Loyalists. The combined fortifications of the Hive defences, coupled with the Loyalist Titan Legios, making any approach assault costly for the traitors. They would instead double down by directing materials and reinforcements from the recently secured systems of the subsector and began pouring supplies into the capital world to support the traitors' assault. In a disturbing act of things to come from what would eventually be the Dark Mechanicum, the traitors also began to mass lobotomize citizens of worlds which were deemed to have become a non-essential workforce, and many hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of drone-like warriors, more akin to something like an arco-flagellant, were thrown indiscriminately at the Loyalist hive city. There was little hope that this would have any positive effect of breaking the city, but it was carried out as a means to diminish the morale of the Loyalists, and this was undoubtedly a success. Having to slaughter many thousands of clear innocents who were little more than fodder is no act of honour or glory for the brave warriors of the Imperial Guard, PDF, or a Titan Princeps. As time wore on, the communications sent out by the Loyalist Forge Wilds were becoming ever more desperate. The first sign of relief for the Loyalist defenders came when a fleet from Atar Median entered the Yanazani system, carrying along with them 2 full maniples of Legio Venator Titans dispatched from Arachnus. Their first objective to secure was the mining world of Yanazar IV, which contained significant and critical mineral deposits. Under the cover of a heavy orbital bombardment, the Iron Spiders descended to the surface and marched upon the entrenched Impalers, who guarded the sole strip of mining quarries that had survived. Their assault was successful, but as a new wave of traitor ships entered the system and the Loyalist fleet driven off, the Titans on the surface now found themselves in an extremely dangerous position. They would soon face a whole wave of landers dropped by Legio Demisium of the planet Urdesh, who had fallen so easily into the pocket of the heretical fabricator general of Mars. The Loyalists were now trapped upon Yanazar IV and facing down a significant force of traitor Titans. The Loyalist Forge World of Graia would now come to the fore. It launches a significant fleet to begin pushing back against the encroaching and offensive forces of the traitors within the system of Uridokini. At Uridoki 5, a month-long Titan conflict is engaged to retake the mining colony from the traitors, but it unfortunately causes extensive damage to the planet's industry and infrastructure, not to mention a total of 8 Titans being felled and 13 others taking significant damage. Meanwhile, at Uridoki 2, the population is slaughtered to a tenth of its previously recorded number in a nightmarish campaign by the Night House of Gotrith, who had participated in supporting the Great Crusade, but who quickly gained a reputation for dealing with any who stood or spoke out against the Emperor or the Imperium with one response, and one response only, and that was brutal slaughter. Where House Gotrith marched, death followed, and only deeds of blood were wrought in their name. It will remain forever unknown if such actions were committed out of a perverse desire to lord their strength over others, or out of a need to show the Imperium that House Gotrith was the strongest of all. When the news reached Dalinar of the War Master's betrayal, they chose a new path, and tragically, the first to feel their blades were the people of the homeworld of Dalinar. House Gotrith turned its machines of war upon those who no longer respected their glorious knight household, and for any who might dare call out to the Emperor for protection. The House Knights of Gotrith were born anew during this time, baptized in the blood of their own people, that they would forever forge themselves a new legacy of bloodthirsting conquest as they reached into the stars to tear down the Imperium. They were driven from their world by House Moratain, who arrived as part of the Loyalists pledging to defend the minimal survivors. But even then, as Gotrith abandoned the planet, they had left behind them mountains of dead arranged in disturbing parodies of human form pinned together en masse were discovered. The survivors protected by the Loyalists were even then struck down by a mysterious plague which cut down as many as 300,000. The cities of Uridoki II were ruined and the planet was left in a shambolic state. This was fairly the norm during the heresy, and one of the reasons why even post-heresy the Imperium was left in a significantly weakened state. Many worlds were effectively razed and left as smouldering ruins, with entire populations annihilated as a tribute to the dark gods. And this for many worlds meant if they were not entirely scoured of life or turned into hellish dark forges, the population were condemned to a miserable, slow death of exposure, disease, anarchy, or starvation. But a final gut punch came to the traitors as the Loyalists rounded on Uridoki III. They faced only a small garrison of enemy Titans, and Greyer sent as many as 20 Titans to break them, which they did, and handily, more an act of spite and vengeance than tactical necessity. The enemy Titans had no chance against the Loyalists. This, though, was possibly a miscalculation by the Loyalists, as the traitors, seeing they were obviously facing obliteration, decided instead to detonate nuclear warheads across the surface of what was an agri-world, annihilating its biological life and severely irradiating the entire world. It additionally ruined the planet's atmosphere and exterminated the entire population. When this action became known across the Belt of Iron, it triggered on some planets immediate surrender to the traitors, who feared they would suffer equal fates should they not give in to the will of the traitor Forge Worlds. It also contributed to further insurrections even within fleet anchorages and caused considerable damage to some Titan maniples in storage. The Loyalists felt that they had turned a corner, but were still feeling demoralized from the apathetic slaughter displayed by the traitors across many worlds. It made them question their entire approach. After all, what can men do against such reckless hate? The massive damage inflicted by the ongoing state of insurrection sweeping through the entire Belt of Iron was creating ongoing problems for the Loyalists, but it was not limited to them, as huge delays were being seen in deploying reinforcements by the traitors as well. Within many traitor-held sectors, there were continual acts of sabotage being carried out by Loyalist dissidents. This led the traitors to become forced to redistribute Titans deployed at Shiluki 2, which was still in a state of being besieged as the Loyalists tried to hold out within the capital hive city of that system. When news that the traitors were actively weakening their position on this world, the Magos Dominus in command of the Loyalists was not about to waste such an opportunity to launch a decisive battle that, if able to be won, would be both significant for morale and crushingly unexpected by the traitors. The main objective for the Loyalists was the seizure of the capital hive world, thereby ensuring security for the region, and to this end 3 detachments of Legio Astroman Titans, numbering a total of 25 god engines, landed upon Shiluki 2 within landing zones secured by Loyalists who were still dug in on the surface. The traitors moved their forces to reinforce these siege lines, creating reinforced fortifications around unconquered hive cities. In doing so, the traitors sacrificed what little momentum they had gained, and in response the Loyalists would lead a 3-pronged assault against hive cities in close proximity to prevent traitor positions from reinforcing one another. The tactical choice was a powerful success for Legio Astroman. The Morning Stars had been relying upon maniples consisting largely of Reavers and Warlords, the strongest elements of Kula Seitai, pushing through them with devastating and unrelenting fire. That steadily wore down the traitors until their void shields were all but collapsing. The confusion and division of the traitors had left them weakened and disorganized, and finally it enabled the Loyalists to break open traitor lines. It still took them 3 months, though, of protracted warfare to gain ground, but when all was said and done, the traitors were finally ousted from Shiluki 2. The last resistance to Loyalist control was quashed after a determined assault upon the hive city of Tartanrus Spire, which the commanding Magos himself took part in, directly commanding the conflict from within the Morning Star's Warlord Titan, Grace of Wrath. Unwilling to expend time and lives upon another siege, the fate of Tartanrus Spire was sealed when the guns of Astroman were turned upon the mountain around which the city itself was constructed, burying it beneath an avalanche of rock. A questionable action, considering the battle for the planet was now all but won, and it demonstrates how so very often within the galaxy of the Imperium, the lines between Loyalists and traitor can certainly appear very, very grey from time to time. Once control of Shiluki 2 was secured, the Knights of House Kolkak were tasked with rooting out any and all remaining resistance, while the Magos committed his forces to regaining control of the remaining worlds within the Shilukini system, and then beyond. We should well remember that the planet, which had been forcibly renamed as Gerulus Station, and its people had a great degree of negative sentiment toward the Imperium and had been relegated to this backwater planetary status. It was now kept in order solely thanks to the strength of the garrison stationed upon the Forge World. And this is another common misunderstanding or incorrect projection questioned about the Imperium. Often, I see it said, why don't some worlds rebel against the Imperium? If it's so awful, surely that would happen. And the answer to that is simple. They do. In fact, this happens with regularity on some areas of the Imperium. The trouble is, when you are often little more than a peasantry and have little if any knowledge of technology beyond your day-to-day, it can be difficult to mount a rebellion against a galactic empire which has literally many thousands of superhuman soldiers backed by trillions of highly disciplined, well-trained, well-equipped armies, because the Imperium would think little of slaughtering a rebelling populace, or worse if it came to it. Most worlds which live under the thumb of the Imperium know far better than to attempt a pointless and inevitably bloody rebellion that would most likely be doomed to failure. After all, if during the Great Crusade, highly advanced worlds, Forge worlds, controlling multiple systems, failed to stand up to the Imperium as it was then, does it stand to reason that a population of civilians in control of little, if anything, would be able to do better? Not necessarily, but it does still happen, for the fact that some do not know what lies beyond their own world. Also, some planets do manage to escape the Imperium, because some live very far out on the rim of the Imperium and maybe through administrative errors become lost or mismarked as dead worlds. So, although it is not known to be especially common, some planets may well revert to a pre-Imperium society and begin to even evolve a culture outside of the oppressive nature of the Imperium. And yes, this could include research and free thinking. So yes, there could well be planets within the galaxy and what is considered to be the territory of the Imperium who do not really remember even what the Imperium is at this point in time. They may even have the icons, the visual representation of the Imperium in their society, but they may have completely lost all memory of what it actually was. And then some planets may even mount a successful rebellion. The problem being that this is usually limited to within that planet itself, which would likely later be crushed by any means necessary, even as far as exterminatus should it come to it. By now though, within the Belt of Iron, the now outright Dark Mechanicum had hoped to find an ally in Gerulus Station. It seemed a straight fit for them, and although it was a crippled Forge world at this point, it still would serve as fertile ground for the rapid expansion of its industry and acceptance of the numerous practices employed by the traitorous order. Both the Ruinstorm and Cataclysm of Iron severed communications across the Belt of Iron, and neither loyalist or traitor had actually maintained contact with Gerulus Station for several years. The last recorded communication had been at the outbreak of widespread rebellions, as well as the presence of entities of unknown origin. The Imperial recorded date of this was toward the end of 08 of M31. It would not be until 011 M31 that the fate of Gerulus Station was discovered. A fleet dispatched from Urdesh to broker a treaty within the world found a dead planet, devoid of all life and civilization. Subsequent picked captures obtained from salvaged traitor ships by Imperial techs were found to contain details of what had remained on Gerulus Station, and they showed towering, featureless buildings of metal reaching up into the skies of the planet, and which were located directly atop where productive forge fanes once stood. Surrounding the world's orbit was a sea of shattered remnants of what were determined to be space vessels in orbit of Gerulus Station, and were the sole remaining indication of a prolonged and presumably bloody conflict. The records recovered from the traitor vessels also described how an Urdesh research team had decided to inspect the planet to determine if it could be occupied and utilized for the traitors. As they made planetfall upon the Forge world, a tremendous cacophony of binary data bursts was unleashed. The towering featureless buildings upon the surface flared into life, and the appearance of dozens of ship signals amongst debris in Geraldus Station's orbit, and metallic vessels of unknown design powered up and unleashed cascading beams of energy upon the fleet. In quick succession, the fleet was lacerated with little ability to withstand the power of the orbital stations, and was reduced to a third of its starting strength, forcing them to quickly abandon the planet of Geraldus Station along with their research team upon its surface. Geraldus Station is now declared as a dead world and access to it prohibited. It is presumed that the most likely scenario is that during its period of isolation, the remnants of the original population prior to the Great Crusade, the tech priests who had fought so bitterly against the Imperium and had been subsequently crushed, had been labouring in secret, and by manipulating the long-forbidden technology encountered by the Imperium on their initial conquest of the world, had now returned to haunt them. And without the power of the Emperor's crusade, these renegade tech priests had unlocked powerful Dark Age technology or Xenos technology that was seemingly far in advance of the Mechanicus. Nothing more is known about the culture of the tech priests of Geraldus Station, or perhaps more appropriate to refer to it by its original designation of Dironth, seeing as it had now been effectively reclaimed by its original inhabitants. Seemingly one of very few worlds to have been able to free itself from the shackles of the Imperium. The only question, of course, is at what cost, as no information exists as to the status of its population or even the tech priests themselves. Within the borders of Forge World Arachnus, it had been well known for some time that two warring ideological sects had fought an ever more furious political battle that would determine the allegiance and indeed the fate of the Forge Empire. The Titan Legio of Arachnus, which had been deployed earlier to aid the Imperium that had spent decades in the Great Crusade, held great respect for the Imperium and its values, and so naturally advocated for standing against the War Master in aid of the Emperor. And while they had been off-world though, there were many others within the planet's ruling body who claimed the unfolding conflict now served as the perfect backdrop against which Arachnus could once again seize control of their own independence. Things though did appear to calm after a variety of implied threats convincing the Forge World to resume shipments of aid and supplies to worlds within the Belt of Iron and further afield. In answer, the rulers of Arachnus dispatched several fleets and several dozen Legio Venator engines to aid the loyalist push into the Nidrana subsector. And so it fell to those who had served widely during the Great Crusade to lead the war efforts of Legio Arachnus within the Belt of Iron, while other elements were given the task of guarding the borders of Arachnus. However, detailed assessment of Imperial records showed that the distribution of Arachnus military outside of their local borders consisted of those who refused to support the idea of independence. Essentially, they had been deliberately placed away from the Forge World to help them consolidate support on the planet itself with a very obvious goal of attempting to effect a change. The first reports of conflict upon Arachnus came in the closing days of 010 M31, with data indicating the discharge of weapons fire within the principal Legio stronghold upon the Forge World. This was an attempt by the now zealous supporters of planetary independence to eradicate any remaining supporters of the Imperium. The so-called Trident's Purge engulfed Arachnus and its two moons, Ikotomia and Nizkara, with later estimates placing the death toll at many million, not to mention 37 Titans recorded as having fallen, undoubtedly from the ferocious internal fighting. Yet all this did not produce a clear outcome, but after several days the rebelling contingent did gain control of both the Forge World and moon of Ikotomia. The battle still raged upon the moon of Nizkara due to fierce resistance by a handful of loyalist Legio Venator Titans. In a message to all within the Belt of Iron, Arachnus pronounced itself as an independent state, declaring punishment for any who defied them. In recognition of this new state of affairs, the traitorous faction of Legio Venator was renamed Legio Tritonus in homage to the three celestial bodies, Arachnus and its two moons. Others knew them by another name, calling them Dark Tide, for the widespread destruction they brought down upon any who opposed them. A Titan Legion known as Dark Tide? Where have I heard Dark Tide before? It's food for thought, isn't it? In the eastern area of the Belt of Iron, the sporadic conflict between Graia and Valia Maximal, which had been happening since the outbreak of the heresy, had by now escalated from regular border skirmishes into an all-out war. Valia Maximal, the traitor world, had remained dominant for the longest time, as a significant portion of Graia's forces were committed to the conquest of the Nidrana subsector and the now escalating conflict with the Beta Garman system. Beta Garman being one of the most destructive titanic conflicts of the heresy, involving the deaths of billions of Imperial citizens, and where at one time over 1,000 Titans fought on the irradiated fields of Beta Garman II in what became known as the Conflict of Titan Death. That story follows at the end of this video as well. The role Graia played in the conquest of Valia Maximal during the Great Crusade is well recorded and by the tech priests bitterly remembered. As well, the continually denied petitions by the leadership of Valia Maximal, who had been demanding reparations for the damage caused by the Morning Star Titans of Graia that had been initially inflicted upon their world during the Crusade. In a now fast escalating conflict, Valia Maximal unleashed its forces upon 3-star systems neighbouring Graia, conquering them in swift succession and denying Graia essentially industrial worlds which primarily aided the production of Titan god engines. Graia dispatched manipores to these 3 systems while also urgently recalling much of their forces committed elsewhere in the galaxy. Forcing their allies to withdraw from the conquest of the Nidrana subsector, it became quickly apparent to the Loyalists that the 3 conquered systems had been transmitting false reports of a heavy presence by those of Valia Maximal, and even that their commanding Magos was present. Instead, all they found were the shattered survivors who related tales of devastating shock assaults followed by rapid withdrawal. The Graia Loyalists were extremely concerned by the unfolding situation, and their fleets scoured the system. Eventually data was coming through which appeared to suggest the forces of Valia Maximal had moved directly to besiege the Forge world of Graia itself. Though devoid of much of its fleet and Titan Legion, Graia was far from defenceless. Like many Forge worlds, the orbital defences could engage with considerable firepower against any invading fleet, and the traitors of Valia Maximal were of course all too aware of this, and so had refitted several battleships with heavily modified Nova cannons intending to outrange Graia's orbital stations. As the battle raged in orbit, a strike force of Legio Laniscara Titans was unleashed upon the Forge world itself, smashing into the planet and bursting from their landers to sweep through the industrial landscape. Of particular note was the Titan Legion's successful employment of Ferox and Venator light maniples. Just a reminder that maniples are just formations of Titans, usually numbering between 3 and 5. A Ferox was made up with 2 Reavers and 3 Warhounds, and the Venator 1 Reaver and 4 Warhounds. These were especially suited to the urban environments of various industrial worlds invaded during the conflict between Valia Maximal and Graia. These featured primarily Impalers Warhounds who would disperse through the streets and herd Loyalist engines into the path of Laniscara Reaver Titans. Alternatively, the Warhounds would focus on just immobilizing their foe before darting away, leaving them stranded among urban debris, left at the mercy of the powerful Reavers who could choose an approach that put them at minimal to no risk before brutally executing enemy Titans, reducing them to a torn apart mess of molten slag, or throwing down fire which would overload their reactors. This precision use of Titan maniples meant the traitors infiltrated an extremely successful assault, and before an efficient defence could be mustered, they had secured a significant number of Forge Fanes. Attempts to land additional ground forces, though, proved unworkable. There were some broken reports which have suggested movement amongst a network of space stations, much to the dismay and confusion of the traitors who had previously no record of their capability to do so. These were then able to act as a direct counter to traitor fleet movements. As they steadily lost momentum and the effective capability to deploy new units to the planet, the traitor fleet retreated from the Graia system, abandoning over 30 Legio Laniscara Titans deployed upon the Forge world, which proceeded to engage upon a sustained campaign of destruction across the surface of Graia. Returning to Forge World Arachnus and its fall to the now traitor fracture, of the original Legio so-called Dark Tide Titans or Legio Tritonus, and what remained of the loyalist Legio Venator, otherwise known as the Iron Spiders, were extremely vocal in their desire to recapture their homeworld, having made several unsuccessful assaults upon the holdings of Arachnus. It quickly became apparent that their efforts would achieve little without aid from their allies, all of which viewed the securing of the Nidrana subsector, which had been besieged for a considerable period of time, as a target of far higher priority than that of Arachnus. Princeps Maxima Procolus, acting Grand Master of what remained of Legio Venator, was left with no option other than to hammer out an agreement with Atar Median that if the Iron Spiders would lend their force to the full conquest of Nidrana, then Legio Atarus of Atar Median would commit a measure of their forces to war against Arachnus and thereby hopefully ensure the recapture of their homeworld. Within the subsector of Nidrana, the loyalist numbers had already been reduced by the redeployment of many Legio Astroman Titans to the eastern front of war, but the 60 god engines brought to the fore by Legio Venator quickly turned the tide, and with a series of rapid assaults driving out Legio Damicium from the Janizarni system, coupled with the retrieval of the fallen engines of Legio Venator from the ravaged planet of Janizar IV, its mining operation, unfortunately now deemed inoperable as a result of damage inflicted by the traitors. Similarly, the loyalists assailed the Paradonali system, committing 50 titans of both Legio Atarus and Venator to besiege the traitors entrenched around the orbital elevator upon Paradonal 1, which linked to the fleet anchorage in orbit. The subsequent siege saw yet more acts of appalling destruction, which were becoming a regular feature now of the traitors. When they were backed into a situation which clearly had no successful exit strategy, they would resort to inflicting maximum destruction upon their enemy's prize before likely succumbing to obliteration. The siege saw 18 Titans fall and was only ended when the traitors turned their guns upon the orbital tether itself, severing the link between the fleet anchorage and the planet itself. The resulting massive pieces of debris which fell upon the traitors' position claimed the life of the primary loyalists commanding Magos and 9 loyalist titans, along with the few remaining traitor titans, and this was devastating enough, but the size and scale of the debris smashing from orbit into the planet caused even more catastrophic damage to the planet's biosphere. This final act of spite, committed as the remaining traitors withdrew, left the loyalists in control of a heavily ravaged subsector. Its industry and populace severely reduced compared to its pre-invasion status. Censuses taken 2 decades after the invasion of the subsector reported a 64% decrease in population and 76% decrease in industrial output, relative to the numbers recorded before the Horus Heresy had begun. No longer capable of supplying the loyalist forge worlds as it once had, the subsector still proved viable and of a strategic worth, not least because it awarded the loyalists a stronghold from which they could now assault the traitor forge worlds directly. Importantly, despite the appalling devastation, victory within the subsector had improved the morale of loyalist forces, prompting many across the Belt of Iron whose allegiance had previously been undetermined to announce their support now for the Emperor and the Imperium, thereby diminishing and undermining the traitors' attempts at finding any new allies. So, although in some respects the conquest eventually of the Nidrana subsector had been a Pyrrhic victory, it perhaps achieved a more positive success in the bigger picture of the Cataclysm of Iron, in that it likely shortened the conflict by denying the traitors additional allies, which would have enabled them to drag out the whole affair for much longer and inflict far greater damage and perhaps even seize other forge worlds to the ruination of all. The devastation of the worlds within the Nidrana subsector was very great, but their sacrifice saved billions of lives. Several years had now passed, and the ongoing war between Forge Worlds was now reaching its zenith. The traitors had been forced out from the Nidrana subsector and were now looking like they had few cards left to play. They began to reinforce positions and were for once primarily setting themselves on a defensive footing. Their new tactic was to bunker down and simultaneously deploy small fleets to create skirmishing raids upon loyalists in a bid to slow down their efforts to reinforce campaigns, as well as launching scorched earth raids upon worlds which displayed any weakness or that were more actively aligning with loyalists, inflicting maximum damage as quickly as possible and then vacating the area. Dark Mechanicum ships were reported as engaging worlds with weaponry which rendered life very quickly completely inhospitable. Many atrocities were committed, as was the mark of the traitors, and their crimes could rarely be paid for with any equal amount of justice. Commonly, traitor titans embarked upon campaigns of wanton slaughter, where they made planetfall, burst forth to lay down appalling weapons of planetary war, normally reserved for engagement only with other god engines. Instead, they turned their weapons of mass destruction upon the billions of refugees that had settled upon the agri-worlds within the system in an attempt to avoid the unfolding war. Worse was still to come though, as in a ritual reminiscent to what occurred on Calth, the traitors were able to somehow achieve manipulation of the system's star, and within days the sun had undergone billions of years of expansion. Those worlds not entirely devoured by the star or scoured clean by harsh radiation were consumed by a warp rift brought into being through the sacrifice of billions. The resulting tear in reality soon became known as the Refugees' Wail, its baleful light visible to worlds across the western fringe of the Segmentum Pacificus. This episode was undoubtedly one of the most harrowing events to befall both the loyalists of the Belt of Iron, but also the wider Imperium. Back once again on the barren world of Findari's spoil, a different method of death was brought down upon the loyalists. An assault by House Vextrix caused much confusion to the loyalists due to its small scale. The actions of the traitor forces also stood at odds with conventional invasion tactics, with roaming groups of House Vextrix knights moving from location to location. To understand the logic behind the traitors' forces, an order was issued to capture an enemy tech priest in order to extract the purpose behind this confusing invasion. After several weeks of running battles, during which House Vextrix managed to destroy 3 Firebrand Titans, the warriors of House Kolkak achieved their goal and captured a tech priest left behind as the traitors enacted a suspiciously hasty evacuation of the planet. Interrogation logs transmitted back to Atar Median tell only of a tech priest seemingly driven mad by corrupted code infesting their algorithms. The final log, transmitted as the traitor fleet reached the edge of the Findari Spoil system, was abruptly cut off, its final seconds recording nothing but harrowing laughter interlaced with bursts of scrap code. Moments later, auger stations deployed across the Findari Spoil reported signals consistent with the detonation of cyclonic warheads beneath the surface of Findari Prime, shortly before the entire world itself was shattered into pieces, taking tens of thousands of Atar Medium warriors, including a decade of Firebrand Titans with it. Following the destruction of Findari Prime, retrieval fleets from Atar Median entered the system to scavenge anything of value, and it was there that they encountered a single traitor vessel. Opening communications, the traitor vessel issued a mocking warning, declaring that the fate of Findari Prime awaited any who continued to oppose the Fabricator General of Mars, before retreating in the face of Imperial reprisals. The apocalyptic destruction wrought by the traitors across the Belt of Iron led to widespread famine. Agri-worlds were often the first targets of aggression due to minimal defences, which feels something of a poor tactical choice when you consider that although some loss of civilians is almost inevitable within conflicts of the Imperium, especially those which are internal, completely abandoning agri-worlds to the heretics who would then burn them to a point of becoming near enough dead worlds seems wildly reckless on behalf of the loyalists, as in short order, other worlds which provide materials and maintenance for forge worlds and hive planets would soon begin to starve and then begin to inevitably cannibalize themselves, quite possibly literally. Attempts to source food from elsewhere in the galaxy are usually unsustainable, especially during the heresy as well, because innumerable worlds had been scorched or pillaged both by the loyalists and traitor forces, leaving most planets unwilling or unable to share their resources. In order that they secure and replenish the scattered reserves of food, both sides moved to redeploy a portion of their forces to secure agri-worlds capable of continued production. As a result, we would see Legio Taurus and Legio Lanniscara deployed to the world of Malinar. In an absurd situation, their attempts at defending the planet through their powerful weaponry, their Titan weaponry, caused irreversible damage to the ecosystem, rendering it unable to produce food and depriving the system of yet another precious agri-world. This is often one of the bleak comedy aspects of the Imperium and the galaxy of the 40k verse, that very often primary objectives become destroyed or contaminated by the sheer power of battles fighting over them, and so the result is an almost Faustian irony. The situation on Malinar became ever more complicated when a Xenos raiding fleet, no longer contained by the Imperial fleets that once patrolled the surrounding sectors, laid waste to both the Imperial and traitor fleets orbiting the planet, stranding both forces upon the ruined agri-world with little hope of rescue. Denied any chance of escape or reinforcement, the war upon Malinar simply continued regardless, with both sides eventually having to resort to guerrilla tactics as the Firebrands and Impalers sought the complete and total destruction of one another. It was only years later that the fate of those who fought on the surface of Malinar was revealed, when Imperium landing parties descended upon the planet and were greeted by a single and heavily battered Firebrand Reaver Titan named Fire of Resolve. The Legio Taurus Titan was the sole survivor of the conflict. The Atar Median god engine Fire of Resolve was heavily stained and visually battered by years of war without end. Yet the Titan stood unbroken, alone against the apocalyptic ruined landscape. The assessment team of each Imperial text noted 7 crudely painted new kill markings upon its armour, presumably marked there by its crew. They were later to discover that the Titan's crew had taken it upon themselves to keep diligent records of their battles against both Legio Lanniscara and the Xenos Raiders. At the personal request of the Princeps, the Reaver Titan's carapace was left bearing superficial damage suffered during this time, and that it was not to be repaired upon its servicing back at their home planet's Forge World. Its legacy remembered through its visual scarring forevermore. None would look upon their glorious Titan and stand ignorant of their final victory. And so now the Loyalists would set their sights upon the traitor-held Forge Worlds of Urdesh and Arachnis, as had been their agreement with the Iron Spiders to finally attempt to secure their homeworld and wrench it from the traitors. Messages from Terra itself had reached Graia calling for the censure of the planet Urdesh for its efforts in transporting supplies to the traitors in Segmentum Solar. Graia would obviously immediately answer any instructions from Terra itself and would dispatch over 40 Morningstar Titans and 60 Knights of House Mortain. Those upon Terra dared not risk the failure of such an important mission, and so the loss and damage to morale would have been catastrophic. So to this end, assistance was sent both in the form of martial strength, with Terra dispatching an octad of Legio Ignatum god engines. These are Titans hailing from Mars itself, forged before the Imperium even existed, redeployed from the outer sphere of defences across the Segmentum Solar to aid the Loyalists on Urdesh. To ensure the safety of such valuable Titans, the fleet carrying the Fire Wasps would use codes acquired by the Sigillite agents that masked their appearance as being that of the traitors, under service to the Warmaster rather than sworn to the Imperium. Indeed, the deception was so effective that upon Urdesh itself, its people celebrated the arrival, apparently, of allies to help in the conquest of the region. Also en masse, the Morningstar's landing craft descended onto the world, directed to landing zones across the surface of the Forge World. Urdesh, having inadvertently invited a most deadly enemy of Graia Titans onto their world, the ruling caste of Urdesh gathered in a widely attended public ceremony to duly greet the representatives of the Warmaster, flanked by a token guard drawn from Legio Damasium. And the crowds were jubilant. The ruling caste felt that this was their moment of ultimate glory, being gifted a personal reinforcement of Titans by the Warmaster. Spirits were high, crowds cheered as the landing vessel ramps of the Titans were lowered, and with a single devastating salvo, the highest echelons of Urdesh's leadership were vaporized, along with thousands of their citizens and the Titans which stood alongside them. Across the Forge World, similar scenes played out: cold, merciless executions, resulted in a series of landing zones being secured by the Loyalists, which then allowed further reinforcements to be ferried to the surface. Unfortunately, domination of a world is rarely achieved in a day, and so the complete subjugation of Urdesh proved to be far more troublesome. With Urdesh deprived of much of their leadership though, the resistance faced by the Loyalists proved uncoordinated yet bitterly ferocious. The people of Urdesh had forever held back those seeking their destruction before, and clearly this was to be no exception. The opening months of the war saw the battered traitors of Legio Domitium heavily depleted by the Cataclysm of Iron, combined with the lack of engine shipments following the blockade of the Red Planet, but they would still punish the Loyalists for their audacity. At the siege of Draunheim, a month-long assault upon the Forge City, 7 Legio Astraman Titans were felled by the handful of Legio Domitium warlords, aided by the Gloria Victoria, a rare and ancient warmonger-class Emperor battle titan. With the traitors contesting every advance the Loyalists made, the forces of Graia paid for each of their steps forward in blood, and the invasion slowly advanced until 6 standard months after the death of Urdesh's leaders. The promised reinforcements from the Segmentum Solar arrived, and the reputation of Legio Ignatum, a Titan legion once honoured upon Mars and defenders of the Imperial Palace on Terra, proved true upon their descent to Urdesh. The Fire Wasps were given command of every battlefield, as each stood a veteran of countless wars. Alone or in pairs, the Legio Ignatum Titans joined the different fronts across Urdesh, guiding the unfolding conflict and lending both their vast experience and the fury of their own Titans to ensure victory. And this reinforcement of elite Titans meant victory came swiftly. The Forge City of Urdesek proved to be the location of the traitors' last stand, with the remnants of Legio Domitium numbering now only 11. While they fought to inflict as much damage as possible, the result was assured from the beginning. The city of Urdesek was reduced to rubble and never to be rebuilt. Its shattered ruins would remain as a censure for their crimes against the Imperium. The largest forged cities of Urdesh were laid waste by massed Titan fire. Its knowledge banks ruthlessly purged of any technology the Mechanicus deemed Urdesh unworthy of, which was a considerable amount, and soon the battered industry of the Forge world was turned only to supplying Loyalist forces operated by fresh numbers of displaced tech priests, now part of a newly formed faction of the Imperium known as the Adeptus Mechanicus. With the Warmaster edging ever closer to Terra, the vast majority of ammunition and weapons produced by Urdesh was now being dispatched directly to the Sol system, intended to reinforce the Twin Gates, the glorious relics of antiquity that facilitated rapid deployment of ships within the core system of the Imperium. Soon after the battle at Urdesek, the Titans of Legio Astraman departed for Graia, intended to escalate the war with Valium Maximal. By order of the Regent, Legio Ignatum was left to stand guard over Urdesh and its holdings, and was also given authority to punish any who dared rise once more against the Emperor. The loss of Urdesh and the manner in which it was dominated for the second time by the Imperium damaged both the cohesion and morale of traitor forces. But for their opposition, it had become a symbol of ascendancy for Loyalist forces across the Belt of Iron. Momentum was now growing for the Loyalists, and many similar planets would rise and fall as Legio Venator and Legio Taurus headed now for Arachnus. The Iron Spiders had a singularly clear vision of recapturing the world in the name of the Emperor, and at any cost. Forge World Calibrax observed that the attention of the Loyalists was focused elsewhere, and now, like many of the traitor Forge Worlds, would abandon its allies in an attempt to fortify its holdings. In doing so, the worlds they had conquered were deprived of the presence of Legio Crulis Setae, and with their oppressors removed, many of their number rose up once more, casting down any traitors that remained. This sense of freedom soon led to a desire for vengeance, and many of the smaller worlds began banding together. And so, a vast flotilla of mismatched ships was formed, hundreds in number and eclectic in design. Few among the tech priests of a powerful Forge world could have anticipated seeing such a sight, as hundreds, even thousands of obscure and sometimes unarmed ships fell now upon Calibrax. Millions would die against the superior guns of the Forge world, Yet, as is often the case in war, the sheer weight of numbers proved superior, and the fleet seized control of Calabrax's orbit. The traitors had not accounted for the strength of will that years of tortured suffering imbued across the worlds held in their dominion, and these ordinary Imperial citizens would have their vengeance. This seemed good in theory, but unfortunately they lacked any real means of conquering the planet, obviously. So instead the flotilla vowed to blockade the Forge world until greater forces came to scour their world clean. They trapped the Titans and the traitors on their planet, and the all-encompassing mass of raging little ships doomed the traitors below to look upon with bitter frustration as they would await their fate. Meanwhile, at Arrakis, the ruling techs of the planet would soon feel the wrath of the Loyalists. Since announcing their secession, the Empire of Arrakis had grown. The title of Dark Tide was fitting given they had become known for brutal and swift assaults, and the traitor Titans of Arrakis had turned to nearby planets without a means to defend themselves for their brutality. But it was these worlds that would be the first to be reconquered as the Loyalist vanguard carved straight through to Arrakis, falling upon its two moons before the wayward elements of Legio Tritonis could be recalled to defend the planet. On the moon of Nizkara, the invading Loyalists found the world heavily contested by those still loyal to the Imperium, the beleaguered defenders having, by some miracle of the Emperor, weathered a siege since Arrakis first fell into civil war. They would be rightfully honoured in the aftermath. Legio Taurus moved to relieve the moon's defenders, breaking open the traitor lines and forcing Legio Tritonis from its surface. On the moon of Ikotomia, a similar fate befell the traitors defending it, as the full wrath of Legio Venator was brought down upon those who had renounced their oaths and stolen their homeland. The traitor titans were scattered like insects from a child lifting a rock, but none were spared. The emotionless fury of the Legio Venator trapped the traitors in their web of destruction. Following the successful conquest of Arrakis' two moons, Loyalists turned to the Forge world itself. With the agreement of those Loyalist citizens who had been forced into exile from the world, the immensely powerful guns of the two moons were unleashed upon the Forge world. The power of the weaponry was so world-ending that it tore vast craters directly into the planet's surface, and the damage destroyed huge areas of the Forge world's industrial landscape, but cleared the way for an invading force of Titans. The battle here on Arrakis would rage longer than most others, and in fact the final glory of conquest was not even achieved until after the fall of the War Master. This of course meant that unfortunately for the Titans falling upon Arrakis, many would perish before Legio Venator once more reclaimed their home. The ongoing War of Arrakis, fall of Urdesh and blockade of Calabrax crushed the traitors within the Segmentum Pacificus of the Belt of Iron. Although lesser Forge worlds still showed some signs of rebellion, the heretics within this region were now on their knees. Few could contest the powerful might of Atar Median, and soon firebrand titans were dispatched from the Belt of Iron. Many of these fleets sought to answer distress calls long ignored, and though such purpose was noble, it largely proved futile, with the fires of war having long since consumed those smaller worlds who had once needed aid, and sadly so often is the case within the Imperium. The Belt of Iron was not free of war, however, for the Loyalist Bastion and Titan powerhouses of Graia remained locked in seemingly endless war against their bitter rivals of Valia Maximal. The Loyalists had faced an unending campaign of attrition orchestrated by Magos Dominus Alpha Heronium, who had sought to disperse the strength of Graia through a series of feints and rapid assaults. It was only with the death of their commanding Magos that the traitors were thrown into disarray. Valia Maximal and its titans now stood unable to muster a coherent assault, but still the late Magos had prepared the Forge world's defences extremely well, and an unyielding line of enemy worlds stood in defiance of Graia. In a logic-defying space of time, the traitors of Valia Maximal had somehow turned these small worlds into planet-spanning fortresses, each demanding blood be shed for every wall that crumbled. For Valia Maximal to fall, the logicians of Graia determined that these worlds must be conquered first, lest their garrisons prove a threat to Graia's holdings. Of the 16 recorded attempts to capture the soon-named Blood Iron worlds, only one success was recorded. The seizing of the now-dead world of Eristara at the cost of 11 Morning Star's god engines and an estimated 250,000 Mechanicum Tagmata losses. Graia maintained its defence for still another year whilst it continued to assault the defence planets of Valia Maximal. This was only achieved by throwing millions of souls into the cauldron of war until the Forge world was all but bled dry. But then, as if by some preordained signal, the tide of traitors waned, the fleets of Valia Maximal retreating beyond their fortress worlds. This change in parameters caused much contention among the logicians of Graia, preventing consensus and stalling their war effort. When no renewed assault was forthcoming, the forces of Graia moved cautiously against the Blood Iron worlds, but found only silence. Disturbingly, 10 dead worlds were all that were found hanging in the void, the halls of their fortifications empty. And then, a similar, yet even more perplexing fate had befallen Valia Maximal itself, for the Forge world had seemingly been scoured clean of its forge cities. Only scattered pieces of industry remained, like some ancient archaeological site. There was no sign at all of the traitors or anything that belonged to them. Upon the surface of the world, the initial landing force reported no detectable signs of life and encountered only the hollowed-out shells of Legio Astroman, the titans that had fallen in the preceding years of war, each one posed as if in great pain and kept standing by intricate scaffolding. As to how or why Valia Maximal departed, none can say. And so, in a bizarre anticlimax, so concluded the Cataclysm of Iron. Billions of souls had been poured into a crucible of bitter spite and furious vengeance. And like so much of the heresy, it left a deep scar across an area of the Imperium that it would never truly recover from. After the slaughter, which had encompassed 2 segmentums and thousands of god machines, weapons so powerful that planets themselves were near enough cracked open, when all was said and done, all that remained in the aftermath was silence. Some worlds remained locked in battle, others had been crushed to a point of near physical exterminatus, others were quite literally scoured clear and now marked as death worlds. The godlike war machines of the Titan legions had done little for those who walked beside them. The Imperium had retained its territory, but still billions lay dead or were now suffering eternal horror at the creatures of human nightmares. Few could realistically call it victory. It would be a long time before the Belt of Iron would achieve anything close to unity, as internal civil wars continued to tear apart planets. Human nature reigned supreme in its rawest form, and without any order, many planets looked like they had returned once again to the age of strife. The titanic machines of Mars had conquered the void, their vast presence and godlike weaponry barely understood by any within the Imperium of mankind, and had once again dominated. The spoils of war were left for the Imperium and the Emperor. But on a small subsidiary Forge world, which had little to no significance, humanity still tore at itself, as raw and animalistic as it ever had been. Within the vast shadow of a long-abandoned titanic machine of war, one man battered another skull into the dirt, until the ground was a sea of crimson, and his hand, wrapped around a dark rock, was now stuck with shards of bone. The shadow cast by the god engine obscured the heat of the sun, and as he stood, a small rock slipped from his blood-soaked hand. The man looked to the skies for the glory of mankind, and the Emperor, he thought to himself. So now I just want to talk briefly about Audible and why it's an excellent service for you to consider getting involved in. As always, I've included some of your comments about why you guys choose to use Audible. Audible is consistently the best value when it comes to audiobooks, and that's more important for people these days than ever. Also, with that in mind, Audible recently released their new plan, Audible Plus, and this is all about giving members a chance to listen to and explore different formats, discover new favourites, classics, or things you've maybe never even considered before. Within Audible, as you can see, you can easily narrow what's available within the Plus category or search within specific themes and genres. The other option is Audible Premium, and that actually remains the standard price as per before, and within that you get 1 credit per month for an audiobook of your choice, and if that's a 40k audiobook, you're looking at often 10 hours or more of content, but then you also get access to the whole Audible Plus range and all the other benefits that come with Audible. Also this month, I'm starting what I hope will be a successful ongoing project with my audiobook club, and I will select a title each month which you guys can get involved in via Audible. If you're not a member with Audible already, this is a great opportunity to trial it and use the free audiobook offer. This month I'm selecting Valdor, Birth of the Imperium. It's an interesting title and not too long at only 6 hours. If you've heard it before, maybe give it a second listen, and then on the last day of this month for January, that's the 31st, I'll arrange a live stream and details will follow on my community tab. You can then come and join me where we'll discuss it live, and all are welcome there, even if you haven't listened to the audiobook. And then next month in February, I'll choose a new audiobook for us to run with. It's a pretty simple format, but I think it'll be fun and engaging for us all. Lastly, I often talk about the best new 40k books, but there's plenty of other content on Audible to check out. Some of my personal recommendations would be Near Enough Anything by the legendary author Philip K. Dick. Having an opportunity to listen to some of his classics whilst doing my miniature paintings has been great to rediscover, especially with the depth and vision of his ideas, so I highly recommend checking out some PKD. You can get involved today by starting a 30-day Audible trial. This gets you a free audiobook as well as full access to thousands of originals, audiobooks and podcasts in the Audible Plus plan. Visit audible.com/Lutin, or for those in the US, text Lutin to 500 500. As always, a huge thanks to all of you for supporting me here on the channel, and I'll see you in the next one.